Couple of years ago, a triad transgender group contacted me about using the parking lot of College Park for their annual Transgender Day of Remembrance, which I learned is usually the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. I said we'd be glad to consider it, so I took Lynn along to meet their representative, Mary, at Port City, Java. We three met, we had a productive time listening to part of her story and being made aware of the statistics of violence against transgender persons. The event was to be a candlelight service, and she asked if one of us could give the invocation. That Tuesday was the night that Nate was arriving back from college, so I volunteered Lynn. So under a cool November sky with the smells of wood fire and leaves, they held a time of remembrance here in our parking lot with the leaders under the Scout pergola, with Lynn and Kelly Joyce in attendance. The planning meeting for this event was the first time in a long time that I had considered what it might mean to be transgender. I wanted to remind ourselves of the trans folk among us for at least two reasons. First, last week in Charlotte, two black trans women were murdered. Friday, two men aged 21 and 33 were charged with their murder. Violence against trans women of color is unfortunately common. Additionally, three anti-trans bills are currently being considered in the North Carolina General Assembly. House Bill 358, Anti-Transgender Student Athletics Bill. Senate Bill 514, Bill to prohibit trans-affirming medical care for people under 21, protect anti-LGBTQ conversion therapy, and require state employees to out gender nonconformity. And Senate Bill 515, a license to discriminate for any medical worker. So, our trans siblings are under attack from various fronts. Even though the LGBT gets lumped together in one tagline, the T is quite different than the L, G, and B. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual describe sexual orientation. Transgender describes gender identity. These are not the same things. Our gender is assigned to us at birth based on visible sex characteristics. Sexual orientation is whom we feel an attraction to and want to date. Gender identity is about whether we identify on that spectrum between male, female, non-binary, gender fluid, or intersex. Gender is a continuum. It is non-binary. Identifying as male or female is not separate, but belongs on the spectrum of what gender identity can be. As one of our deacons, Matt Cravey, has said, sexuality and gender identity are a lot more complicated than A or B. There are a lot of labels, but not every person fits a label. Don't speculate on what they are into unless you intend to play touch and smile and think that they want to do the same. If someone asks to be addressed by gender-neutral pronouns, do your best to respect their wish. If you don't, it's your choice, but you look kind of like a tool. There are people who are born one sex, but feel a different gender. A child can be born with female genitalia, but be masculine in her actions and mentality, both in feelings and in processing. And although society pronounces her female, she feels male. The first time I thought seriously about transgender was reading in seminary John Irving's The World According to Garp, and being introduced to the amazing character of Roberta Muldoon. In a book all about gender, Roberta has a better understanding of it than most. Roberta Muldoon was a standout NFL tight end. You don't get much more stereotypically manly than that. And after her professional football career, despite her delicate heart of hearts, Roberta will always have a body like a highly trained rock. That makes her the ideal bodyguard for Jenny Fields. It took chutzpah for Roberta to come out as transgender. GARP was published in 1978. But what's worse is that Roberta doesn't feel completely comfortable, since she's been met with skepticism from the feminists and men alike. It's not until later that Roberta realizes her burden can be a gift. She now has, quote, the vanity of a middle-aged man and the anxieties of a middle-aged woman, a perspective that is not without its advantages. She comes to peace, finally, with all the aspects of her identity. A woman through and through, she no longer concerns herself with society's expectations for who or how she should be, and instead learns to appreciate herself in all her powerhouse feminine glory. This is the proper role of literature in our lives, to introduce us to people that we might not meet otherwise. And if you saw the film, John Lithgow is perfectly cast as Roberta. Think about how deeply our gender is connected to our identity. Here's a quick quiz from Philip Gully that I'd love for you to help me with. I'm going to name some relationship categories, and when I name a relationship category that you fit in, please raise your hand and keep them up. If I name a second category that you're in, just wave your hand. Okay? Here we go. Raise your hand if you are a father, a mother, a grandmother, grandfather, an uncle, an aunt, a niece, a nephew, a grandson, a granddaughter, a son, a daughter, a husband, a wife, a sister, brother, father-in-law, mother-in-law, stepmother, stepfather, stepsister, stepbrother, boyfriend, or girlfriend. Now, notice that all those words that define us, they denote gender. All those relationships are the primary ways that we understand and define ourselves, and they all have to do with gender. Every hand was raised unless you were too stubborn or oppositionally defiant or it hurts to raise your arm. In fact, our gender and our identity are so closely linked, it is extremely difficult to imagine and understand ourselves apart from our gender. Our gender is central to who we are. I think most of us feel quite comfortable with our gender. It would be difficult for us to imagine being another gender. Most of us are even quite comfortable and even happy with our gender, and it can't imagine being otherwise. It fits us well. We have grown into our gender. But there have always been people for whom that isn't true. Less than half of 1% of the population. We've never understood why until recently. For most of our lives, it was believed that transgender people whose inward gender was inconsistent with their gender assigned at birth, it was believed that those people had suffered psychological trauma as children, causing them to reject their assigned gender. This has been our default explanation whenever we meet somebody we don't understand. We just assume they've experienced some psychological trauma. And sometimes that's true, but scientists believe it's no longer an adequate explanation for why some people are trans. We know that nothing that happens in the body without first happening in the brain. Gender identity, brain. Sexual orientation, brain. Body type, brain. Personality, brain. Pain sensitivity, brain. The brain drives everything. We talk about the heart being the seat of emotion, but it isn't. The heart is a muscular organ. The brain generates and facilitates our emotions. When we fall in love, we feel our heart race. It's because our brain told it to. Nothing happens in our bodies without first happening in our brains. Scientists have studied the brains of trans people, and here's what they've learned. Trans people have brains that don't match their gender assigned at birth. When we've been able to scan their brains or study them afterwards, the brains, for example, of some male to female persons have had more female characteristics. Conversely, some trans people moving from the more female side of the spectrum to the male side have more male characteristic braids. I mention this as an example, not to neglect our gender continuum on which exists non-binary, gender fluid, and intersex people. I'm not completely sure that sex assignment has any real basis in scientific fact. It may rather be another construct that continues to reinforce an oppressive identity structure. So from the day that they are born, transgender people have been moving towards their brain type. Because of their brain's exposure or lack of exposure to certain hormones during fetal development, their outward gender is inconsistent with their inward gender. Events happen at birth that most of us never know. It's not an everyday occurrence, but it's also not infrequent that babies are born with ambiguous or incomplete sexual anatomy. In the past, surgeons have made the decision about whether the child would be a boy or a girl based on what would be the easiest surgical fix. What I just said about brains was unknown, and so it wasn't considered crucial. Today, much more thought is given to these life-changing decisions. Remember when our children were born and we say, it's a boy or it's a girl. What we're really saying is that at a certain stage in their development, the presence or lack of presence of testosterone program the fetus to grow a certain type of sexual organ. 99.5% of the time, the organ accurately reflects one's genetic gender. But sometimes it doesn't, which is why some people are transgender. Trans is Latin for across, so trans people are those who have moved across the gender continuum, or are naturally inclined to want to because their inward gender doesn't match their assigned gender. So they are moving towards the gender of their brain type. We know this now. The scientific community has demonstrated evidence indicating this. It isn't a religious theory, it isn't a political theory, it's a psychological trait occurring during our fetal development, and thus it's beyond our control. Emphatically and conclusively, transgender identity is not a choice, it's who a person is. Did you choose to have red hair? Did you choose to be tall or short? Did you choose to have the genetic markers that you have? Of course not. Transgender persons are simply acknowledging that the gender identity assigned to them at birth because of the physical anatomy does not match the brain, the biochemical and genetic gender identity that they know inside. Trans persons are not transvestites. Too many people get these words mixed up, in part because the words sound similar, and most people frankly have no real knowledge of either. Cross-dressers, identified in slang as transvestites, are people, typically men, who are happy with their gender, but derive pleasure from occasionally dressing like the opposite gender. Cross-dressing is not about something other than gender identity. It's crucial to understand because it means they are not transgender, wanting to formally cross over to the opposite gender of what they find themselves. Further, trans persons are not pedophiles. Did you know that the typical profile of a pedophile is an adult male who identifies as heterosexual and most likely is even married? There is zero statistical evidence to link transgender persons to pedophilia, something our state leaders choose not to acknowledge. From my limited perspective, trans people hate all the attention that they're getting. The typical trans person wants desperately not to attract attention. All of this publicity and talk of bathroom habits is highly disconcerting to people who have spent their lives trying not to stand out or become the center of attention. So what does all this have to do with the gospel? As you know, the Bible talks a great deal about gender, sex codes, and relationships, but it was formed by a limited understanding of human development. Thousands of years later, we know so much more about sexual and gender formation. So we have to stop treating those formed differently as sinners or moral failures. They are, in the case of transgender people, simply persons whose outward gender and gender assigned at birth are out of harmony, who are moving towards a new harmony now, towards gender integration, for which some of us have happened to us before we were born. As you can imagine, having to do this after you were born is incredibly frightening and difficult. I included the passage from Acts 8 to remind us all of the first recorded Christian convert on the continent of Africa, who was someone whose sexuality was non-binary, whose gender and sexual identity isn't known to us. Led by God's Spirit, Philip met the Ethiopian eunuch on the road, another summer road story. Isn't it terrible that we don't know the person's name? And this text is by Luke, who names everyone. So sadly, this one is identified by his sexuality and ethnicity. I did not have us hear Deuteronomy 22:5. A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, no shall a man put on a woman's garment. For whoever does such thing is abhorrent to the Lord your God. Man's item likely meant a sword. Modern Jews use this verse to argue that women should not join Israel's armed forces. This was also a rule of war that prevented male soldiers from disguising themselves as females to hide themselves from their enemies. Additionally, in ancient Israel, where the sexes were constantly segregated, this prevented one sex from invading the other's space in order to commit adultery. Furthermore, the second half of the chapter in Deuteronomy is all about intercourse and marriage. Men's and women's clothing are separated for the same reason. The Hebrews separated many items. Only 4 verses later, the Torah says not to plant different seeds in the same vineyard. And the very next verse separates oxen from donkeys. The verse after that separates wool and linen. Torah is filled with instructions of separation, especially how Israel must be separate from other nations, and the Levites separate from other tribes. Different scholars have different theories for the motivation of this, but they all acknowledge this theme. And on top of this consideration, Christians do not follow Torah law. Occasionally people will point to Genesis 1:27 as a condemnation of trans identity. Male and female, he created them. Most transgender people will let you believe that God has in fact created them as either male or female. The problem is that they have been labeled by others who are not God. Some people today typically identify as gender fluid, meaning they find themselves as with bits of both male and female identity and cannot definitely say that they are one or the other. This might sound unsettling to some on first hearing, but a return to Genesis might help. We also learn that God created night and day, and that God separated the land from the sea. Yet we have no trouble understanding the existence of dawn, or dusk, or marshes, or everglades. The point of Genesis 1 is inclusion, not exclusion. The ancient texts tell us that God created everything and, not or. The other lesson we need to keep learning from Genesis is that all humanity is created in the image of God. Everyone, without exception. When we look at others who are different than us and try to see them in the image of God, then we gain a new understanding and empathy. John Pavlovitz is tired of some conservative Christians. This is at the heart of why we're talking about this issue today, to try to counter the hate du jour. Here's an excerpt of what he's written, called Dear Offended Christian. Dear Offended Christian, I'm tired of hearing you tell gay people that they can't simultaneously be both gay and Christian. I'm tired of having to explain what transgender means to adult Christian people, who I'm quite sure have internet access and know better by now that it's not just a guy in a dress. I'm tired of arrogant pulpit bullies who believe that they are entitled to tell people where they can pee and whom they can marry and whether they can really love Jesus or not. I'm tired of you being more outraged by red coffee cups and department store restrooms than by poverty and racism and gun violence. I'm tired of gay people being accused of the kind of predatory behavior that straight men have been exhibiting since the man cave was an actual cave. I'm tired of reminding us that the number of times that Jesus spoke about gender identity and sexual orientation in the gospel is 0. I'm tired of having to explain to people that although I am a Christian, I'm not the type of Christian that is the type that is generous with damnation and stingy with grace. I'm tired of LGBTQ teens cutting their forearms and jumping off buildings because they've been told by their church friends that God hates them, and because their Christian parents told them, because their Christian pastors told them. I'm tired of the followers of Jesus who don't seem interested in cracking open a book to see what we've really learned about the brain and the body in 2,100 years, or to realize that gender identity and sexual orientation don't equal the word homosexuality in the Bible. I'm tired of all the time I have to spend undoing the damage the church has done to queer kids and their families. I'm tired of religious folk who seem to want small government everywhere except the bedroom and the bathroom. I'm tired of scientific ignorance being treated as if it's a Christian virtue. I'm tired of hearing preached verbatim the gospel of Fox News. I'm tired of high-profile pastors blaming gay people for 9/11 and hurricanes and terrorism and child obesity. I'm tired of waiting for you to show up in this world and actually show the freaking love of Jesus to the people the way that he did and told you to, without excuses or theological tap dancing to avoid it. I'm tired of this wasteful, fruitless, mean-spirited, unprovoked, unbiblical attack on the LGBTQ community that is squandering so much time and life and beauty in the name of a God who is supposedly love. I'm so tired of so many people believing that Christian and bigot are synonymous and not disagreeing with them. I'm tired of a church that seems to be so ambivalent towards the teaching and example of Jesus. I'm tired of a Christianity that makes me more and more embarrassed to be associated with it. My pastor friend Leah said it so well. I think about sex and gender, and indeed all differences of race, status, and levels like this. God has given us a way to know ourselves best. It's in intimate relationships, for it's through intimate relationships that we can learn our emotional boundaries, how we act in stress. We learn where we are selfish and where we are selfless. We learn where we are lovable and where we need some work. If we ask individuals to forsake intimate relationships, we are asking them to never fully know themselves, or never feel what it's like to be loved and what it's like to love. How could God, who is love, condemn a person to live without love? There are other options, such as acceptance. We can offer acceptance to people no matter what their differences. We can embrace the idea that we are all made differently, that none of us is exactly like the other, and love is the source, the fabric, the purpose of creation. And hence love is the intention of the Creator. Acceptance is only the first step. Inclusion is good. Celebration is better. If we celebrate with our friends who come out, we are saying, God didn't make any junk. Last Tuesday, I was refereeing a varsity girls soccer match at one of the high schools with two other refs, Bob and Jorge. I was not the lead ref, so I didn't have the final say. At halftime, Bob said to us, "What should we do about the boy?" "What boy?" I said. "The one on the blue team. He's the captain that joined us in the center for the coin toss." Okay, I didn't notice any boy with us." "How do you know that player's gender?" I asked, genuinely perplexed. "He's obviously a boy," Bob said. Well, it wasn't obvious to me. And if she identifies as a girl, that's good enough for me, and apparently for the school, too. "He could dominate play," Bob said. When Jorge replied, "But she's not." I thought, good job, Jorge. being a kind grown-up is hard work. So we should give ourselves the grace to be wrong. Gender identity is about a person, about who a person is. It's about their fundamentally being as humans created by God in God's image. An image that God has created to be good. Amen.